Hi, my name is Andrew Tenzer. I'm the director of Group Insight at Reach.
Hi, my name's Ian Murray. I'm partner and co-founder at House 51.
Yeah, so we thought that we would take a bit of time to talk today, kind of about the reaction to something that Ian and I did last week, and I guess some of the lessons that we can learn if we work in marketing and advertising and strategic roles, etc. Some of you will know Ian and myself. We co-authored a very kind of study that went quite big last year that was published called The Empathy Delusion. We've obviously produced a program of research looking at kind of the differences between people working in marketing and advertising and what we'd call mainstream audiences. And Ian, I guess you wanted to kind of kick off the conversation by some of the observations of, I guess, what happened last week.
Yeah, I think this is the interesting point for us was that this is a white paper that we published originally. Well, it's almost a year ago, isn't it? And because of the situation we find ourselves in now, webinars were something that we started to do through necessity. And what we found is the empathy delusion has taken on another life and has found a new audience. But a lot of that has now been being discussed through social media. And the thing that I said to you the other day that interests me after the webinar was my social media feed was full of after Mark Ritson shared one of her charts, which essentially was just saying that since 2018 until the end of April, when we were in the coronavirus crisis, one of our key frameworks that we're looking at was values and that they hadn't changed at all. This started a really interesting debate in marketing between what you might consider as two camps, the nothing will change camp and the everything will change camp. And just thought this was an interesting thing that when you look at the debate, there was this determination to either, as Mark Ritson would say, get into the pornography of change and everything being different and it's all been swept away. And then those that are saying nothing will change. And there seemed to me very little room for anything in between and very few people that were in the it depends camp, or it may be a bit of both. And to me, that seemed like a very interesting mirror on what marketing tends to be like, that you have to be either one thing or another. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of room for nuance and the kind of on the one hand and on the other hand responses that feel to me more like how the real world really works.
Yeah, and I think what was quite interesting for me is there's lots of people who would look at something like that, and from the data that Mark Ritson shared from our webinar, and kind of say, well, this just isn't the case. Everything's changing, but without any real evidence to back it up, which is always quite interesting. That it's kind of ignore the evidence that's presented in front of you, and just use your gut instinct, which I think kind of takes us on quite nicely to talking about what we actually said in gut instinct, because I think it's quite relevant to these two camps that you talked about. So back in 2018 now, Ian and I published a paper called Why We Shouldn't Trust Our Gut Instinct, where we essentially proved that people working in advertising and marketing unconsciously see, think, experience and interpret the world differently to mainstream audiences. And much of the work that was grounded in was from psychology, from the work of a guy called Richard Nisbett. Ian, do you want to talk a little bit about his work?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that Nisbett, the real insight that he had was taking a cross-cultural perspective, and he was much more interested in a global perspective and contrasting people who are living in the West and people who are living in the East. And this idea that there are these two very, very broad thinking styles, an analytical thinking style, which would be the one that would apply to people living in the West, which is one that's very focused on seeing the world as very atomized and seeing the world as full of things to be categorized, discrete and autonomous categories that can be known and then predicted. And I think this will sound very familiar to people, hopefully, living in countries like the UK. And he contrasted that with a thinking style from the East, which is based on a very different kind of cultural and economic experience, which is a holistic thinking style, and the idea that people that live in the East see things as a circle and are very much more kind of focused in terms of the way that they experience and interpret the world on the relationships between things, and actually therefore understand the world as a much more complex and interdependent place, and therefore because of that find it much more difficult to understand the world, and therefore are much less confident in predicting what will happen. And so we obviously took this and saw this as quite an interesting comparison to the culture that we would argue that you see in marketing, which is a very much more analytical based culture than a holistic culture. And obviously one of the key things that our research showed was that doing a lot of the same cultural experiments that Nisbet had done, we found that this difference was proven, that marketing was much more likely to be an analytical place rather than a holistic place focused on categorization and prediction. And it seems to us that, in a way, the reactions to our research are further kind of validation of the research itself, and that the reactions seem to fit into this analytical thinking style as well, and are determined to go along different camps of categorization about what's going on.
Yeah, and I think it's quite interesting because one of the things that Nisbet talks about in his book, and I think I've read elsewhere, is the idea of that idea of seeing everything in a straight line.
Yeah.
So if you think about when you were back at school and you learned about the causes of the First World War or causes of the Second World War, it's always a linear progression. This happened, then this happened, then that happened. Whereas in Eastern cultures, they tend to learn it more as a kind of holistic viewpoint and not one thing leading to the other. So I think it's very, I guess, enticing for people in our industry to think, well, this has happened and this is going to lead to this and everything's going to change. But actually it's understanding the relational context between all these things. And of course, we're not saying that nothing's going to change as a result of COVID, because obviously it's a huge thing. The context is massive. But I think we need to, what we saw, I think Ian and I saw this week in many of the comments that were kind of put on Mark Ritton's post, is that there is an element of that straight line thinking, as Ian said, which kind of backs up what we've been talking about for some time.
It fits in with another thing that we referenced as well, which is we came at it from John Kay's book Obliquity, and the idea about whether things happen in a direct way or whether they happen in an indirect way. And again, I think one of the things here is that there's this focus on, in marketing, looking for a very direct answer to whatever the issue is that's being discussed, and not being very comfortable with the idea of uncertainty, so and there's Kay himself talks quite a lot about the work of Isaiah Berlin, and it's something that I noticed the other day. I'm not going to be able to remember the name of the guy who published it. There's a book called The Hedgehog and the Fox, and the idea that the hedgehog thinking, the hedgehog knows one thing, and the hedgehog rolls into a ball when a predator comes and puts all the spikes out, and that's the hedgehog's big idea. That's what it has. Whereas a fox knows many little things and is very nimble. And so Berlin talked with these two different thinking styles, hedgehog thinking, the one big thing. And I think you can see that again. It's an analogous idea that, marketing, it feels as if you always have to have one big idea and stick to it. And the idea about saying things might not be clear, or there may be nuances, isn't something that a lot of people feel comfortable in admitting. And I think you see that a lot in the discussion of COVID or any other big issue that there is in marketing, is that people feel they have to go into a camp on it rather than be in the one hand or the other camp.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this brings me on probably to one of our major bugbears that you and I have been talking about since this whole COVID thing happened, is in terms of the research that's being published quite regularly by research companies and strategic consultancies, etc. We talk about COVID trackers, and how we as people working in our industry have to be very careful as to kind of taking these insights on face value, because most of this research is framed and anchored in a way which gets people talking about and thinking about COVID specifically, rather than just asking the same sorts of questions that you would normally ask without mentioning it at all. So you're not anchoring. The only difference being that the context has changed. And I know Ian and I, we've talked about this quite a lot, haven't we?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing, because researchers, marketers, we're human beings, and like anyone else, we're watching the news, we're consuming media, and the only story in town is the coronavirus crisis. But obviously, what we should be doing, in theory, is filtering that before we go and do the work that we do. But what happens is, and we know this from all the other research that we do, is rather than manager kind of perceptions, we tend to just project them onto our work. And so suddenly, questions that would always have been asked in every survey you can imagine get framed in terms of coronavirus, because the assumption is that things have changed and we are priming people to think about that change, when in fact the actual crisis is big enough on its own to do all of that work for us. But what we're doing is we're being frankly too human in the way that we're doing our work, and allowing our own experience, unconsciously sometimes, but other times consciously, to be projected onto the work. And then that only produces one answer: change. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, really. Change. We believe in change. We're comfortable with change in industry, and then also we prime everyone that we talk to think in terms of change. And it shouldn't be any surprise that that's the answer we get.
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, it's just our message is to be wary of the types of research that that gets put out there. I suppose we're not going to ramble on for too much longer, but it would be good to talk a little bit about empathy in the world of COVID, because I think we recently kind of went back and researched some of the frameworks that we'd used from the empathy delusion. I guess from our perspective, our hypothesis was that actually we wouldn't really see much change, and that actually there is still a kind of empathy gap between people working in our industry and mainstream audiences. And Ian, that's exactly what we found, really. There's still that gap exists, and we've still got to work hard to close it.
Yeah, and I think it's a message that people in the industry still find difficult to hear, even though our work has been, it's got a lot of traction, and a lot of people have read the Empathy Delusion. I think you mentioned about 800 people have viewed the recording of the webinar we did last week. So
if we can trust those metrics, because obviously they are YouTube metrics and whatnot, and we all know the problems with those.
Yeah, but they're from one or two different places, but there's a lot of people anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, so the general argument that we've made is becoming quite familiar to a lot of people, but it's still, I think, one of the things I think is interesting, Andrew, from the reaction from the webinar last week is that there's still not quite an appreciation about how deep the kind of issue is. You know, we've become very comfortable in marketing about talking about behavioral economics and unconscious bias and implicit reactions, etc. But this is the actual key point here: is it's very difficult to see how these differences and these empathy gaps that we are showing are going to change if we expect simply individuals just to be better from now on. It's actually a much deeper cultural issue that we're dealing with that requires organisations to change rather than just expecting individuals to do more empathetic marketing, you know. And I think that's the next step, is about actually kind of a discussion about how you can start to close that gap, and it's not going to be closed by just saying person X or Y do better in their jobs. It's about an organisation embracing some of this and thinking about the composition of their organisation and all the other things we've talked about before, Andrew, like cognitive diversity, etc. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. And Ian and I will be tackling this subject further. Next month, we'll be publishing our follow-up to the empathy delusion, the aspiration window, where we'll be going into a lot more detail about that, because, as you say, it's not even just an organisational thing; it's probably an industry thing more broadly.
Yeah. Well, Andrew, it's even bigger than that.
You're right.
It's a cultural thing. You know, as we said at the beginning of the webinar the other day, many other industries have the same thing, and this is basically about how in our society now we educate people and how we a certain class of people end up in the same jobs, and so it's a generational thing that's kind of hardwired, and it's one of the key things is that there's a lot of work now. I'm thinking about the work that Orlando Wood has done as well, and that's been taken on board. But as I say, the real point is that Orlando talks about these being analytical and holistic thinking going in historical epochs. So it is quite a big issue, and we aren't going to get any better at it, unfortunately. We just think that we can wake up one day and do different advertising and it'll all be okay. Yeah. You know?
It's obliquity. Today I'm going to wake up and just be more empathetic.
That's right.
Doesn't quite work like that.
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so I think we'll finish it there. Thanks for your time, Ian. We'll see you guys later.
Okay, thanks.